Hello. Good evening and Jai Bhim, one and all. I, Rosalie Gaikwad, extend a very warm welcome to all of you from the Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture Organizing Committee 2023 to the 19th edition of the Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture, TISS, Mumbai. Let us start this evening. Let us start this evening with the song Kabira Kahe Ye Jag Andha, a powerful and meaningful song sung by Ravindra Sathe from the movie Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, directed by Jabbar Patel, marking the commencement of AML 2023. I request the song to be played.
कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा, कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा। कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा, कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा। जैसी गाय बछड़ा था सो मर गया, अंधी जैसी गाय बछड़ा था सो मर गया, झूठी जाम चढ़ाए। कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा, कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा। दरिया रिमझिम बरसत पानी, रिमझिम बरसत पानी। पूरब दिशा से उठी है बदरिया, रिमझिम बरसत पानी, ओ रिमझिम बरसत पानी। अंधी जैसी गाय बछड़ा था सो मर गया, झूठी जाम चढ़ाए। कबीरा कहे ये जग कबीरा कहे ये जग अंधा। पर्दा पर्दा छोड़ ले, पर्दा पर्दा छोड़ ले, बिन पर्दे की बात। पर्दा पर्दा छोड़ दे, तुम पर्दे की बात। दुल्हन से दुल्हा मिला दो, दुल्हन से दुल्हा मिला दो, भीगी बछड़ा था सोवर गया अंधी जैसी गाय बछड़ा था सो मर गया झूठी जाम चटाए कबीर कहे ये जग अंधा कबीर कहे ये जग अंधा कबीर कहे ये जग अंधा कबीर कहे ये जग अंधा
Thank you so much. That was indeed a beautiful start to today's event, and I'm sure that it has transported us to the beautiful era. Ours is a battle not for wealth, not for power. Ours is a battle for freedom, for reclamation of human personality. These are the words of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. The reclamation of human personality, in the words of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, the chief architect of the Indian Constitution, visionary philosopher, educationist, historian, and the greatest humanist, has been said to be achieved through the cultivation of the mind. At this moment, being Shraman, or the laborer in the field of knowledge, I recall the lines of Lokshahir Vithalumab and Harendra Zadav. They wrote and sang, Layas geli yuga yugachi hi nadin avakara, paha paha manzura hamaja bhimraya zamara, which translates to, the ages of agony and sorrow has now weathered away. See Manjura, the cuckoo bird, look, this is the garden of my Bhimraya. So, now, I once again welcome you all on the behalf of the 19th Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture Organizing Committee and TISS students community. I especially welcome today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeremy A. Rinker, Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, USA, Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, Dr. Shalini Bharat Ma'am, Director, TISS Mumbai, and Deputy Director, Binu Paul Sir, Professor Ramaya Sir, Faculty Coordinator, Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture 2023, TISS Mumbai, and Students Union General Secretary, Shivani, and I request them all to take the seat on the dais. Thank you, everyone. Now, may I please request Dr. Shalini Bharat Ma'am, Director, TISS Mumbai, to kindly felicitate today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeremy A. Rinker, with a flower bouquet and a Buddha statue. Thank you, ma'am. Now I request Professor Ramaya sir to kindly felicitate Director Dr. Shalini Bharat ma'am and Deputy Director Bino Paul sir. call upon co-convener AML 2023, Charitra Vena Lanjevar, to felicitate Professor Ramaya Sir, the Dean of the Equal Opportunity Cell and Faculty Coordinator of AML 2023. Thank you, Charitra Vena. I also request you to felicitate our Students' Union General Secretary, Shivani Ilangovan. Thank you, Charitra Vena. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce today's esteemed speaker and the theme of the 19th Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture. Our guest for today, Dr. Jeremy A. Rinker, is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, USA. The theme for the 19th AML is Ambedkar, Nationalism and the Need for Contemporary Collaborative Activism. In this B.R. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture, Dr. Rinker will develop ideas from the discipline of conflict transformation and peace building and locate Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as a conflict transformation practitioner. Even though many argued during Dr. Ambedkar's lifetime that he was an anti-nationalist and tried to portray him as a destructive force, indeed his agenda was collaborative, constructive, and pro-social. Dr. Ambedkar showed us that education is a jewel, but not in the sense of a finite object to be obtained. Rather, he showed us that education is a process to be respected. We must therefore remember a key argument of Dr. Ambedkar, that we as humans maintain a fraternal sense of curiosity throughout our lives. This fraternity, not nationalism or ideological orthodoxy of any sort, was Dr. Ambedkar's primary message. Coupled with praxis, this message of fraternity has broad and deep implications for Ambedkarite social sense. Realizing this and looking towards the future, Dr. Rinker's talk calls for increased contact between both subcaste and Savarna and Avarna communities. Thank you. Now, may I please request Director Dr. Shalini Ma'am to kindly inaugurate today's session and deliver the inaugural address.
Dr. Jeremy Rinker, Professor Ramaya, Professor Bino Paul, faculty colleagues, and dear students, and all those who have specially come here for this event. Welcome and greetings to all of you on the occasion of the 19th Dr. Ambedkar lecture titled Ambedkar, Nationalism and the Need for Contemporary Collaborative Activism by Dr. Jeremy Rinker from the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies of the University of North Carolina. There is a saying in Hindi, Suraj ko diya dikhana. It's like, you show a lamp to the sun. And talking about Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, I always feel the same way. It is so humbling. It is so deeply, moving that one gets the opportunity to speak about him or even to address you all on this important occasion. And as I've always said, that I'm no expert on Dr. Ambedkar's work, legacy. I feel that just saying a few words is honoring me, not the other way around. Dr. Ambedkar was an embodiment of humaneness and an intellectual par excellence who walked tall among his contemporaries in questioning the most fundamental issues surrounding inequalities in society. His clarion call for spreading education, for creating awareness and invoking human rights of the most marginalized and the downtrodden was instrumental in bringing about social awakening among masses. And I just now talked about that, for him education was a process. His questioning of discrimination along caste lines in Indian society's hierarchical structure, and his advocacy for equality of opportunities laid the foundation for the policy of social protection. And I think we really need to talk about his emphasis on creating opportunities for everyone. And I think this is what Professor Rinker's lecture also is trying to say, that it was really about cooperation among all the divisive forces in society. Above all, Dr. Ambedkar will, of course, always be remembered for his leading role in framing of the Indian Constitution, quite easily one of the most evolved constitutions in the world, and described by some as first and foremost a social document. Through his far-sighted thinking and actions, he ensured constitutional guarantees and protections for a wide range of civil liberties for individual citizens, and most importantly, for the wide range of affirmative actions in the form of reservations to ensure education and employment were not denied to those socially oppressed and deliberately kept away from learning and from progressing and from moving on to higher levels. Dr. Ambedkar was a fascinating personality, and if any one of you have read, and I'm sure many of you have read his works, we find that Dr. Ambedkar was a multidimensional personality who contributed to several themes, from banking and labor welfare to women's education, health, employment, power sector, water resources, among many others. Many of his suggestions were futuristic and ahead of his times. For example, his ideas on collective farming, development of wastelands by giving them to landless laborers, and minimum wages to labor class, etc. Always a champion of the socially downtrodden, he called for changing the system from within. His clarion call to eliminate the caste mindset and not just untouchability is testimony to the fact that he believed in bringing about fundamental changes and not just cosmetic changes. At TISS, we began the AML series sometime in 2003, and with 1 year's exception, I think, this is the 19th AML lecture series, and we are extremely proud that we continue in this tradition of bringing this lecture series to all of you. At this 19th AML series, today I feel privileged to welcome Dr. Jeremy Rinker to deliver his lecture on Ambedkar, nationalism, and the need for contemporary collaborative activism. With a small rider that I will need to leave a little early, so if you don't mind, but I'm here for some time. Thank you very much, and thank you all of you for being here.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I call upon the stage Professor Ramaya sir to say a few words on the occasion and tell us all about the history of AML.
Listening to Professor Shalini Bharat gives me an impression that maybe in a year or two, she will be on the dais delivering Ambedkar Memorial Lecture. Yeah, looking back, as he said, the 2003 and earlier period, every institution has its own history. Nothing happens so easily. Although it is rather embarrassing to talk about certain things, but in appreciation of whatever TISS has done, I want to say a few things. There was a time when I joined in 91 in this institute, 1991 as a faculty. Prior to that, there were seniors who went to the High Court to implement reservations. But I'm saying it was that time. We have universities even today which has not started implementation of reservations. You compare those institutions and compare Tata Institute. From that time onwards, from till date, we have so many cases, so many instances where so-called reserved category faculty have been selected in general category. And 2 years before, I am very proud to say here, the top 3 students of PMIR, the School of Human Resource Management, from the so-called scheduled caste background. Otherwise, you see, that's what Tata Institute. I am very proudly saying this, because when many do not want to implement reservations, here is a case where you not only implement reservation, you implement in such a way that people from such background are able to come on the top list of many schools. And that credibility, the struggle for that started. I think fortunately we had one after another very good directors, positively took whatever the initial struggle, and now wherever we are, where we have Professor Shanli Bharat, almost when she speaks we say, okay, this is another memory lectures. In fact, I told her last time, and I'm confident about it. So with a lot of limitation we started, but then subsequent directors, registrars and the entire administration supported. Now it is an institute program. It is not a program of any organizations. In any institutions, any independent organization holding a program, naturally it has its own challenges. So there are institutional structures, means, and through which if you go, probably all these things are possible. Ambedkar Jayanti, well, we started, family used to do it, now it has become again this proposal was actually mooted by our Professor R.R. Singh at that time. So now it has taken a formal shape, and it is going on with the complete support. This hall, I don't want to say how much it would cost if we take it from outside. This and many other support we get without any issue. So why Ambedkar we are celebrating? Not because of any other individuals. He was a #1 scholar, first of all. He is a #1 scholar. I don't think even till date any Indian who has achieved credentials like Dr. Ambedkar. A master degree economics and a PhD from Columbia University, another master degree in economics, another PhD from London School of Economics. He went further to University of Bonn to secure another degree. Columbia conferred another PhD. So the credentials are immense. And his scholarship is so much. You don't know what we have already got in the form of published work is not even 50%. He already cried in one of the articles he's written. He lost much of his writing when he returned back from India. So his scholarship is yet to be utilized in academic for whatever reasons. I'm happy to say that Ambedkar's first 2 essays were a compulsory reading for our foundation course students. I believe this is followed. I don't think many universities have this. We do this. So I would like to also fondly remember everyone who struggled and brought AML to today's level. And every year we also have a cultural program one day before the Ambedkar Memorial Lectures, and are excellent ones. And this would not have been possible without the support of the directors since then, and now Professor Shanli Bharat. One mail immediately approved, and she's here. I wish such cooperation will continue in the future time also. And in fact, she just arrived. She was out of, she just arrived. I kept on telling her, but she called me, I'm here. And in the meantime, I approached Professor Vinod Paul, he's also here. The first time we are having director and deputy director on dice for AML. That is also a very positive thing. In nutshell, what I'm saying is there is a complete cooperation. There is no politics behind. I think no academic institution can ignore the scholarship of Ambedkar, because as Professor Bharat already said, he has written on multiple fields. And we should slowly try to get his scholarship on our compulsory reading. Before not taking much of your time, thank you so much once again, Professor Bharat, Professor Vinod Paul, for your support and guidance and your presence at this point in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ramaya sir, for your insightful words and encouraging words, and taking us back to the history of AML and the history of TISS. Now, I invite Ms. Charitra Vena Lanchevar, co-convener of AML 2023, to give a brief introduction about today's speaker, Dr. Jeremy Rinker. Charitra Vena, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rosalie. Dr. Jeremy Rinker is an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, USA, where he researches the intersection between narrative and non-violent social change. In addition to his year of experience of university level teaching, Dr. Rinker also has over 6-year experience in non-profit program management, international relief and development, and conflict analysis and resolution. His work area currently as an associate professor focuses on South Asia, political violence and resistance and resilience in the face of collective trauma. He graduated in 2009 with a Doctor of Philosophy, Conflict Analysis and Resolution, George Mason University, Arlington, USA. His dissertation topic was Just Peace Prospect for Peace Building and World View Tolerance, a South Asian movement's social construction of justice. He completed Master of an Art, Asian Religion University of Hawaii, Honolulu in 2001, and a Bachelor of Art, Political Science and Philosophy, dual major, University of Pittsburgh in 1995. Dr. Rinker research interest includes social movements, discursive framing of social conflict, social justice, mobilization of majority population, collective historical trauma, remembrance and storytelling, religion, conflict and interfaith, peace building, restorative justice and group dialogue in conflict intervention practices. His research revolves around the centrality of justice discourse, trauma awareness and collecting resilience in movements aimed at transforming social conflict, historical injustice and structural violence. His work has long focused on caste, social movements framing, organization and mobilization. He has worked with the marginalized communities to create the space and structure to address all types of violence, resist injustice and develop platform for the social resistance to blossom and grow. His work has been previously published in Peace of Change, the Journal of Peace Education, Peace Research, the Canadian Journal of Peace and Conflict Studies, and Peace and Conflict, the Journal of Peace Psychology. His book, Identity, Right and Awareness, Anti-Caste Activism in India and the Awakening of Justice Through Discursive Practice, Conflict Resolution of Peace Building in Asia, Lexington, was published in October 2018. Dr. Jeremy Rinker is also a former Peace Corps volunteer, Kazakhstan 1995-1997, and a two-time Nehru Fulbright Grant awardee at Banaras Hindu University, Malviya Center for Peace Research 2013-14. He was awarded the 2022-23 Fulbright Nehru Teaching and Research Grant from the US Department of the State to work at Symbiosis University, Pune, India, for his project Trauma-Informed Framework for Inclusive Peace. He is also a board member of Institute for the Peace of Harmony, local non-profit, and an awardee of Faculty Excellence in Research and Collective Activity from UNGC and HSS. Dean. He has also awarded the Asian Network Faculty Enhancement Program grant aimed at deepening Asian studies in liberal arts, funded by the Mellon Foundation for the 2015 Thailand seminar, entitled Thailand, Power, Land and Belief in the Divided Society. He also has to his name in 2018 HSS Contribution to Diversity and Inclusive Annual Award among many others. Dr. Rinker is currently in Pune and aims to outline what inclusive peace would like in a complex heterogeneous society with competing identities and communities. His interest in India caste conflict from graduate school when he was introduced to the social engagement Buddhism of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar during his visit to India in 2013. He spent the time with the People's Wellington's Committee of Human Rights, which works to prevent the exploitation of marginalized groups in India. He planned to incorporate the research he gathered while in India for the second time. In a new book, he is authoring on the role of trauma and emotion in conflict transformation of practice. On the behalf of Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture, I welcome you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Charitravena, for that brief introduction. Now, may I please request the Deputy Director of TISS Mumbai, Vinopal sir, to kindly chair the session.
So, welcome, Professor. I should not stand between an excellent lecture, and I think I invite Professor for a wonderful lecture. That's a waiter, please.
Now is the time for which we had been waiting for a very long time. May I please request Dr. Jeremy Rinker to take the stage and enlighten us. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the warm welcome. I appreciate it very much and don't know that I deserve it. At some point, it might be nice, and I hate to take Baba Saheb off the screens, but it might be nice. I have a few slides that have my title on it, so I can, and a few other things that do a little bit of introduction of who I am. You got quite a bit of that already, so I may skim through that part a little bit. But thank you for this opportunity and this great honor to deliver the 19th Annual Ambedkar Memorial Lecture at TISS Mumbai. My impression of the many TISS Mumbai graduates that I've met with during my travels in India have been nothing short of stellar. With great command of English language and a deep grasp of India's social reality, I have yet to meet a TISS Mumbai graduate that is not both capable and determined to make transformative change in the world. Therefore, to be invited to give the 2023 Ambedkar Memorial Lecture, I'm humbled and honored. In addition to the formidable TISS students, I feel like I stand on the shoulders of great giants of past lectures here on this very stage. Gail Omft, Christoph Jafferlot, Concha Ilia, and many others have graced your annual lecture series. I can only hope that I am worthy of being in the same category of these great lecturers. Thank you for students and faculty for the confidence in me, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you tonight. Your confidence and warm welcome are much appreciated. So you might see up on the slide my title, which is Ambedkar Nationalism and the Need for Contemporary Collaborative Activism, and I have actually put in parentheses movement, thinking about activism and movement and how the two might interact. Interestingly enough, I think the second part of the title is probably much of the thrust of what I want to try to get across tonight. Why intra and intercaste contact matters. I must admit that I thought of an alternative title and a more radical title for this talk tonight, something like, was Ambedkar anti-Hindu or pro-social? Reading Ambedkar as a pro-social supporter of the nation and not a nationalist. So I want to kind of stick with this idea that what I want to get across is really this idea that intra and intercaste dialogue and contact is really important to moving the discourse and the movement or the collaborative activism of Ambedkarism forward. I decided to stay with the first title as I want to argue strongly that Ambedkar's thought was in no way exclusionary, but rather inclusive and pro-social. Baba Saheb's life work should drive us away from hardened identity and hardened identity labels, and towards creating spaces and structure for intra and intercaste contact. Such contact between different communities is a precursor to any annihilation of caste. On January 18th, 1943, B.R. Ambedkar delivered a memorial lecture of his own on the 101st birth anniversary of Mahadev Govindranath. In the opening to that address, Ambedkar admits that, quote, addresses delivered on anniversaries of great men are generally occasional pieces. They don't have much permanent value, end quote. Of course, all that Ambedkar thought and spoke in his lifetime is, in our present age, vested with great importance and value. This makes an Ambedkar Memorial Lecture a very daunting task. Indeed, a task that I would have requested the organizers give me a little bit more time in advance to prepare for. Nevertheless, tonight, I have organized some preliminary ideas about what I see in contemporary Ambedkar anti-caste movement writ large. I hope to raise questions and provoke thinking about why the Ambedkarite movement is not more unified and cohesive in our current day. Further, I hope to think collectively about how we may work to make Ambedkarite social movement more collaborative as a counterforce against growing nationalism and nationalist rhetoric. You see, I come from a field of that privileges praxis. So any talk that I give aims to focus on both theory and practice. Paulo Freire, the renowned Brazilian Marxist, activist, and thinker, argued that praxis of education was action relating theory to practice in a specific context that challenges power relationships and leads to transformative action. All my work in teaching and research aspires to Freirean praxis. Freirean praxis is similar to the idea of action science introduced by a faculty member named Kurt Lewin. Science in the service of action. This idea was that science shouldn't be done just for science sake, so he was not a bench scientist. He was someone who was pushing for the idea that science should have meaning. It should be in the service of action. As Paulo Freire has eloquently written, quote, I must intervene in teaching the peasants that their hunger is socially constructed and work with them to help identify those responsible for this social construction. This is the long-term orientation and pedagogical promise of conflict transformation, my chosen field of praxis. This field is about developing positive peace, not just managing or resolving social conflict, what in my discipline we might term negative peace. As one of the founders of the evolving field of praxis, of this evolving field of practice of conflict transformation, Jean-Paul Lederach argues, quote, conflict transformation is a comprehensive orientation or framework that ultimately may require fundamental change in our way of thinking. So it's good, you've switched to slide 2. You've heard a little bit about me, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on framing who I am, but this slide gives you a little bit of what is peace and conflict studies. You've heard my bio, it's up here. If you missed it, you can catch that. But on the right hand, or the left hand, your left-hand side of the slide, you see that peace and conflict studies or conflict transformation is interdisciplinary, it's multi-level, it's focusing on intrapersonal, interpersonal, intergroup, and international conflict. It's focused on origins, processes, outcomes, right? So it's all of those things. It's also neither focused on conflict as neither good nor bad, right? We as a field of peace and conflict transformation professionals are not trying to argue that we should get rid of conflict. Conflict is the source of social change. We're a praxis field, theory-informed practice and practice-informed theory. We don't privilege one or the other. We look at both of them. It's not about management or this kind of idea of negative peace, as I said before, but social transformation and positive peace. That's what conflict transformation is aiming at. So what exactly is conflict transformation? Conflict transformation is a process, is a complex social, political, and cultural means of addressing historical harms in ways that build peace for future generations, rather than simply aspire to solve problems or manage disagreements. Ambedkar's life work, as well as the movements that followed his life work, are all examples of conflict transformation and conflict transformation praxis. Again, quoting John Paul Lederach, quote, "A transformational view engages two paradoxes. How do we address conflict in ways that reduce violence and increase justice in human relationships? And how do we develop a capacity for constructive, direct, face-to-face interactions and at the same time address systemic and structural changes?" So obviously, the caste system, there's structural and systematic injustices. And I'm not arguing that we should just bring people together not realizing that, right? But actually taking this paradox into account. This tension exists in all movements for social change and conflict transformation. Practitioners know that conflict is neither good nor bad, but rather an opportunity for constructive social change. The annihilation of caste was not just a destructive agenda, it was a constructive one. I know to speak of Ambedkar movement is problematic. There is not one movement, but rather many movements that claim his name. Like in religion, there is no such thing as Buddhism, there are only Buddhisms. In Ambedkar movement, we can only talk in plurals. Caste abolition movements face great challenges from external enemies, as well as internally from within Ambedkarite communities. Nationalist forces co-opt Babasaheb's image, while many Ambedkarites get stuck on debating what was his true ideology or his true method of social change. Ambedkar was prolific, writing and speaking for a span of over 4 decades in public life. Like any great thinker, his thoughts evolved and changed over time. As they say in academic circles, the more you know, the less answers you have. As a great thinker, Ambedkar's thoughts changed substantially across time. Ambedkar's prolific scholarship both opens new epistemologies and raises new questions. This is the great value of education and learning. It is a never-ending process, not an end goal or an outcome. So as I mentioned before, peace and conflict studies is not always focused just on outcomes and resolutions, but on the process to get there. Part of the message I hope to send you home with tonight is that we should never forget and value the universal truth of the evolving nature of human knowledge. We must build on Ambedkar, not get caught up in ideological debates and disagreements about what constitutes his most important message or his true ideology. Ambedkar was human, and like any human, he was complicated and complex. We must study his thoughts as a process rather than as an outcome, and work to make them relevant for our current day. In a 2017 Forward Press piece on Ambedkar, I wrote, quote, "Unless activists work to complicate the story of his, Ambedkar's life and work, his legacy and full impact are done a grave injustice. Ensuring his revolutionary legacy requires more than memorialization through the thousands of statues erected in low-caste bastis across India. How activists make Babasaheb new and innovative for this time hinges on how they strategically tell his story, how they complicate and interrogate it. I would only add now that this requires a humble sense of ambiguity, critical thinking to adapt his ideas to our new age, and a fraternal desire to be ever open and curious. Fraternity, not nationalism, ideology, or ideological orthodoxy of any sort, was Babasaheb Ambedkar's primary call. I can only hope to further this claim and inspire collaborative action for change in what I have prepared to share with you tonight. I aim to do this by framing Ambedkar's work as that of conflict transformation. By labeling Ambedkar a peace builder or conflict transformation practitioner, I am not trying to impose a Western framework on Babasaheb, but rather aiming to articulate how much of a forward thinker Ambedkar was on important issues of social change. So now we've shifted to slide 3. So the question of what is Ambedkar in terms of, how is Ambedkar a conflict transformation practitioner? So some may or may not have been aware before coming here tonight that I come from a very young and emerging field of peace and conflict studies. You've heard a few things about peace and conflict studies. It's a growing field in India. It's really only about 1950s or so actually about 70 years old in the United States, really post-World War II. So it's a multidisciplinary field, engaging with lots of different approaches focused on the unit of analysis of conflict, as I've already said. We work to not eradicate conflict, but see it as potentially constructive and not just destructive. Of course, conflict happens on various levels of human interaction, from interpersonal to international. We have what's happening in Ukraine. We have violence that's happening within families, right? This is all the area of conflict and peace and conflict studies. My field is particularly concerned with social conflict. That is, conflict that emerges in the social sphere and impacts social progress and social development. For Babasaheb, this social sphere was crucial to any political or economic change. This social sphere required social democracy, or as my colleague Dr. Santosh Raut calls it, a spiritual democracy. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar says, "What sustains equality and liberty is fellow feeling, what the French revolutionaries called fraternity. The word fraternity is not an adequate expression. The proper term is what Buddha called Maitri. If in democracy, liberty does not destroy equality and equality does not destroy liberty, it is because at the basis of both there is fraternity. Fraternity is therefore the root of democracy." And that's from Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, end quote. For Ambedkar, fraternity or Maitri, metta, loving kindness, born of the ideas that I am you and you are me, is the root of all positive social change, and thus the root of collaborative democracy and consensus making. This perspective was in complete congruence with Ambedkar's adopted religion of Buddhism. But one does not have to be a Buddhist to appreciate the importance of fraternity for creating lasting social transformation in society. Social contact, and indeed fraternity, is critical for democracy, and indeed social transformation of any kind. In this way, Ambedkar was ahead of his time. He was revolutionary. He was a peace builder before that term was even in common parlance. So just a side note here, peace building as a field came about really after Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the UN General Secretary, put out an agenda for peace in 1993, in which he talked about peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. The UN professes to do all three of them. I would argue the UN does peacekeeping really well, and many Indian forces are participating in that negative form of peace. But I don't think the UN does peacemaking or peacekeeping very well. Peacemaking or peace building very well. As a peace builder or conflict transformer, Ambedkar was not only ahead of his time, he was also retelling the story of Indian Buddhist history to argue for nonviolent values of dialogue over conflict and war. His retelling of Buddhism was a social retelling that he saw as an important spark for social revolution and change. Much of the controversy over his posthumously published The Buddha and His Dhamma revolves around the story he tells about the Buddha's renunciation of the householder's life. Rather than the orthodox story of the Buddha's renunciation, in which he views old age, sickness, and death, thereby leading him to sneak away from his wife and young son in the middle of the night, Dr. Ambedkar frames the Buddha as a mediator, pressing his song for continued dialogue to avert war over the Rohini River. This social reading of Buddhist history was the grounding of Ambedkar's thought on social transformation. Even though he didn't write about it till later, this was grounded in his thought in some of the things he wrote much earlier. Still, we do not often think of Ambedkar as a peace builder. His long career, culminating in his final written work, The Buddha and His Dhamma, is a testament to the driving force of nonviolent peace building guiding his writings and actions. Modern activists would do well to remember that fraternity and peace building guided Baba Saheb's work even before writing on and or officially conversion to Buddhism. So what can we determinatively say about Ambedkar as a conflict transformation practitioner or peace builder? So this is what you have here on the slide. Firstly, Ambedkar was resolute in what Uri, Fisher, and Patton, 1981, they originally wrote a book called Getting to Yes, frame as the one of the key goals of what they call principled negotiation, the need to separate the people from the problem. In their book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Without Giving In, Uri, Fisher, and Patton argue that, quote, an open mind is not an empty one, end quote, and argue against getting too stuck on the problem and forgetting that relationships with people matter most. In The Annihilation of Caste, Dr. Ambedkar writes, quote, people are not wrong in observing caste. In my view, what is wrong is their religion, which has inculcated this notion of caste. If this is correct, then obviously the enemy you must grapple with is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras which teach them this religion of caste, end quote. Baba Saheb throughout his long career never wavered in his attempts to engage with Hindus. The Jat Pak Todak Mandal was a group of Hindu reformers, and even though they did not allow him to deliver his speech, which was later published as The Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar consistently argued for engagement and contact. He never shied away from confrontation, but he also saw the need to engage, negotiate, share, and dialogue with those that were not in full agreement with him. This was Ambedkar's form of Deweyan pragmatism, and his understanding that we are all, in Aristotle's sense, political, or better yet, social animals. The second reason I see Ambedkar as a peace builder, this leads me to this second reason to read Ambedkar as a peace builder. His evolving adherence by the mid-1920s to Buddhism was born of a deep commitment to fraternity. Buddhism provided indigenous South Asian language for truth of human interconnectedness. Pratyasamutpada, often translated in English as codependent origination, in arguing for the idea that there is no first cause, articulates a world in which we are all interrelated and interconnected to each other. This is the basis of Ambedkar's radical sense of fraternity. By fraternity, Ambedkar meant something more than simply brotherhood. Fraternity in Ambedkar's sense was understood as bandhuta, or bindedness to and with each other. I'm indebted to Harsh Mander's 2019 ideas on bandhuta here, this idea of bindedness to and with each other. That's more than just this idea of brotherhood. Ambedkar's radical sense of fraternity as a philosophically and rationally grounded sense of interconnectedness forms the foundation of his peace-building approach. How can you not focus on relationship if we are all interconnected? How can you not focus on relationship if we're all interconnected? This foundation opens the potential for not only contact, but dialogue and critical engagement. Such dialogue provides opportunity for democratic social change. In the words of Ambedkar, quote, democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence toward fellow men, end quote. That's again from The Annihilation of Caste. Ambedkar saw democratic politics as a result of social relationships and fraternity. In The Annihilation of Caste, he reminds us, quote, political revolutions have always been preceded by religious and social revolutions. In The Annihilation of Caste, he further critiques the stance of socialists, arguing that caste and economic status is at the core of the problem of discrimination. Caste for Ambedkar is primarily a social problem. For Ambedkar, caste as a social problem can only be solved via democratic social transformation, which is only possible with fraternity. So fraternity is the guiding light of social change and social democracy. A third reason Ambedkar can be seen as a peace builder is implicit in his humanistic approach to empathy. Since social relations are foundational to political and economic change, preeminent to any structural change in society is a sense of empathy. Empathy is a social feeling. A sense of radical empathy or love was central to Ambedkar's message. This was not love for any one community, but rather a Buddhist love for all sufferers, a Mahayana Buddhist vow to save all beings. This again involves what John Paul Lederach, the grandfather of conflict transformation, describes as not just concentrating on, quote, the substance and content of the problem, but rather centering, quote, attention on the context of relationship patterns. Relationship patterns underscore the context of caste oppression in a way that content of laws, rules, and mere description of social norms cannot. So this focus on context over content, I think, is grounding a lot of what Ambedkar is arguing for as a peace builder. Dr. Ambedkar understood well this focus on empathetic relationship and radical love as central to lasting and structural change, or what he would call the annihilation of caste. In the annihilation of caste, he states, a caste has no feeling that it is affiliated to other castes except where there is a Hindu-Muslim riot, end quote. This sense of social identity must be eradicated if the annihilation of caste is to be achieved. Ambedkar understood there was no empathy across caste lines of graded inequality. So how does one create empathy where none exists? My field would argue through contact. That's how you create the empathy where none exists. If communities remain separate, no possibility for radical empathy exists. We know from Todgfell and Turner's famous 1979 study of social identity theory that the mere presence of an out-group can create a discriminatory response in the in-group. The only way to engage this discriminatory response is to create contact, a la Gordon Allport's 1953 work on contact theory, and open spaces for empathetic sharing and spaces for dialogue. In the current moment, our focus on the context of relationship patterns should make clear the need to build bonds of shared pain rather than use them as bludgeons to shame and attack our adversaries. The human tendency is to retaliate, but as the Christian saying goes, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I would argue that the only solution to socially transform caste conflict, and therefore create political and economic transformation, is to create spaces and structures for intra and intercaste dialogue. I have long been writing and thinking on this subject, and this writing is informed by theory, but grounded in practice. After all, change is really all about praxis, Freirean idea of theory-informed practice and practice-informed theory. So let me say a few things. You can switch to the next slide if you want. Let me say a few things about the kind of theoretical roots. I know this slide's a little small, but the kind of why am I talking about intra and intercaste dialogue all the time, right? People are asking me this, oh, well, we're not ready for that, right? The movement's not ready for that. And I've been arguing for some time that when does the movement become ready for that? I think the movement's ready for that. So here's the theoretical crux of my praxis-based argument or call for inter and intracaste dialogue. conflict is nested in this kind of model. The circle that you see on the slide is coming from Marie Dugan's work on nested conflict theory. Issues are nested in relationships as our subsystems are nested in systems. That nest is thatched, I would argue, by emotions and trauma based on real context of past historical harms. So in the introduction that was given about me, I'm currently writing a book about conflict practice, and I'm arguing that our focus on interests and needs in the field of conflict resolution has missed the boat in terms of trauma and emotions, right? That trauma and emotions are critical, and we're often shying away as conflict practitioners in a move to stay in a kind of rational mind. And sometimes we have to move outside of that rational mind. Failure to create spaces and structures for contact and dialogue around identity difference leaves room for social identity to fester and get discriminatory response to proliferate. We know this from social scientific research on conflict and social identity theory. In such a dynamic, victims become bitter and perpetrators become complacent, feeling as if their actions are either justified or will be handled by the state with impunity. The spaces and structures of transitional justice mechanisms, everything from memorialization to truth commissions and dialogue circles, are sorely needed to truly annihilate caste. This is not simply the purview of the state. Civil society and social movements themselves have an important role to play in this important work. These transitional justice mechanisms can make change, even if these are baby steps along the way to caste annihilation. So I'm not arguing that transitional justice is going to shift the discourse immediately to caste annihilation. It's a process, right? It's not an outcome. Remember, it's a process. So let me give you a little bit. So these are some, just before I shift to the next slide, I'll just say these are some of the theoretical roots of this kind of practice work. I've mentioned the nested conflict in the circle that you see on the slide, but also I want to highlight the idea of restorative justice and restorative questions. In my field, there's a move towards restorative justice and focusing on sometimes called restorative practices. And these practices are bringing parties together in the case of harm and really asking these three questions. What happened, who was harmed, and how can we make sure it doesn't happen again, right? Pretty simple. Seems simple, not as easy when you get parties who are in conflict and harm together, right? But that idea is really the crux of this idea of transitional justice mechanisms. I shy away from transitional justice commissions, and because that pigeonholes you into one form of transitional justice, and transitional justice is many sets of mechanisms. So that's kind of the theoretical roots of what I'm talking about. If you flip to the next slide, I want to kind of make the case for collaborative activism and resistance to nationalism and other isms. And I want to do that by talking about a couple of experiences in the US context. And so I'm going to take you outside of India and move you to a couple of places closer to my home. One of these happened in the city that I currently live in. So this is my kind of case for collaborative activism and resistance to nationalism and other isms. My own American context of race and racism gives many important examples of the power of transitional justice initiatives. We, of course, have yet to annihilate racism, but progress in collaborative action is happening in local contexts around my country. Let me briefly illustrate two relatively recent examples. The first is listed up here, and these slides I'm happy to share with people, and you can go and check these two websites further for more about these cases. The first one is about the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or sometimes called the Greensboro TRC. So Greensboro, just to give you a little background, I'm at the UNC Greensboro. I oftentimes tell people when they hear I'm at UNC, the University of North Carolina, they think I'm at Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill is the flagship campus of 16 other campuses in the UNC system. There are 20,000 students on my campus, right? So it's a big campus, but it's not the campus that Michael Jordan played basketball, right? That's UNC Chapel Hill, who didn't make the tournament, by the way, this year. But I'm at UNC Greensboro, which is about an hour away. Greensboro's in the middle of the state of North Carolina. And on November 3rd, 1979, a group that called themselves the Communist Workers' Party was trying to organize an interracial march of local textile workers. So Greensboro is sometimes called Jeansboro. Wrangler jeans, which some of you might be wearing, actually originated from Greensboro, right? That company is still based in Greensboro. They're not called Wrangler anymore, they have a different name, but they're still there. And so sometimes Greensboro is called Jeansboro, like the jeans that you're wearing, right? So on November 3rd, 1979, a group called the Communist Workers' Party organized an interracial march of local textile workers, lots of textile workers especially in the 1970s and 80s in Greensboro. The march was entitled Death to the Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, arrived in a caravan of cars to disrupt the march. In the end, 5 activist organizers of the march were killed, and the police were nowhere to be found. Interestingly enough, this story is not really well known in the United States because the next day, November 4th, 1979, I don't know if anybody knows, but that's the day the US hostages were taken in Iran. So the news story about the Greensboro massacre was the number one news story on November 3rd. Then by November 4th, it disappears almost entirely. And so in 2003, a group of survivors was able to hold the first ever Truth and Reconciliation process in the United States. They held commission meetings and public hearings to try and get at the truth of what happened and who was affected. So remember those questions: what happened, who was affected, how can we make sure it doesn't happen again? This opened the space and structure for deliberative democracy and dialogue across white and black communities. Though the final report recommendations have not been fully followed, they did have an impact. The place where the killings happened has been memorialized. The city of Greensboro issued a formal apology. Took them a while, but they issued a formal apology on August 15th, 2017. This is an ongoing story, not fully told or completed or completely healed, but is an example of why engagement, conflict, and dialogue matter. They help move communities towards the ideal of reconciliation. If you're interested in these slides, you can look, the link to the Greensboro TRC final report is actually on that link. They wrote a very extensive final report, which you could easily dig into and learn more about that. I gave a grave injustice to that story by telling it so quickly. It's a much more detailed story than that. But the final report tells of that story. The second example I want to use comes also from the American South. The works of the Equal Justice Initiative, created by lawyer and MacArthur genius Brian Stevenson in Mobile, Alabama, is a testament to the power of contact in creating space for a transitional justice narrative about past harms. A death row lawyer and activist over 20 years, Brian Stevenson's EJI, or Equal Justice Initiative, has raised funds and developed 2 important projects of memorialization and remembrance. The Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice are both examples of the important work of changing the narrative about the African American experience in the United States. The Legacy Museum in Mobile, Alabama, housed in a former slave warehouse, a place where they were trading and buying and selling slaves, uses interactive exhibits and multimedia presentations to trace the American experience, the African American experience, from 1619, in the introduction of Africans into chattel slavery in the United States, to Jim Crow laws and the mass incarceration of our modern era. The second project they're working on, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, honors the more than 4,400 men, women, and children lynched, burned alive, drowned, and beaten to death by white mobs between 1877 and 1950, collecting soil samples from all the counties that experienced such atrocities. This memorial is a sacred space for remembrance and truth-telling. So both these are in Mobile, Alabama. If you ever are in the American South and visit them, they're spaces where people can reflect, memorialize, and understand, and dialogue around and create contact around this alternative narrative to the African American experience. These two examples are important means of contact for truth-telling and restoring the narrative of the African American experience of resistance in the United States. I think Brian Stevenson is really a MacArthur genius. He's just a genius in general for pushing forward this idea and really finding the resolve and resolution to raise the funds to do this. It has shifted the narrative. Again, baby steps, not necessarily shifted the narrative entirely, but shifted it in positive ways. These kinds of examples can be beacons for like collaborative movement action in the Indian context. Like the Black Panthers, they can inspire and create the means of contact. So that's what I'm pushing for, is this idea of the means of contact, creating some spaces and structures, and that sounds amorphous, but spaces and structures where parties can come together and engage in an alternative dialogue about the past and heal from real examples of trauma, caste trauma, race trauma, you know, these real events that happened, right? And living them and experiencing them and allowing others to hear that story. So in conclusion, let's turn to Dr. Ambedkar's ideas of nation and nationalism as important context for contemporary social movement activism. Dr. Ambedkar was clearly a founding father of the nation, and he was also clearly cautious not to assume a nationalistic stance. Again, in The Annihilation of Caste, he writes, quote, "There are, however, many Indians whose patriotism does not allow them to admit that Indians are not a nation. They are only an amorphous mass of people," end quote. His cautions about nationalistic rhetoric and the creation of a single national story was born of his direct experience as an untouchable in the Indian Raj. His cautious optimism on the eve of Indian independence was prescient and mindful of the lack of spaces and structures available to his community to share their experiences in systems of graded inequality. In our day and age, we've had some places where those spaces and structures have come, right, have arisen. Dalit autobiography, I haven't mentioned, you know, the Dalit Panthers and their influence and connection to Black Panthers, right? This literature movement created that space. So we've had some spaces, but in Ambedkar's day and age, there weren't a whole lot of those spaces. In his speech to the Constituent Assembly in 1949, he says, "This caution is far more necessary in the case of India than in the case of any other country. For in India, bhakti, or what may be called the path of devotion or hero worship, plays a part in its politics unequaled in magnitude by the part it plays in the politics of any other country in the world. Bhakti in religion may be a road to salvation of the soul, but in politics, bhakti or hero worship is a sure road to degradation and eventual dictatorship." That was again from the 1949 speech to the Constituent Assembly. Such warnings should form a firm grounding for collaborative activism for structural change in Ambedkarite community and Ambedkarite communities. Without spaces and structures to contact, share, develop fraternity, or metta in Indian society, his warnings will and have started to come true. I see this conflict dynamic progressing in the ways that Baba Saheb warned, and I hope that others will take similar notice and similar stock of this kind of destructive dynamic I'm again focusing on not the destructive but constructive. As a conflict transformation professional, thinking of ways we shift from destructive to constructive conflict. Ambedkarite anti-caste movement must heed Babasaheb's call to organize, educate, and agitate by bravely engaging with the other. And I put other in quotes, right? Because we're all connected, we're interconnected. This means working to develop spaces to share lived experiences between Avarna groups as well as Savarna groups. This intra and intercaste contact will be crucial to lasting conflict transformation and structural change. To be clear, this is not a call for mere contact, but strategic contact and dialogue. John Paul Lederach again reminds us that, quote, pushing inappropriately for inter-identity exchange without a framework or preparation and adequate support can be counterproductive or even destructive, end quote. Still, with no contact or dialogue, caste conflict and trauma will fester. Identity creation, awareness, and strengthening of the Dalit community are important movement goals. But are we not at a time in 2023 that self-esteem and Dalit identity have already emerged as a powerful force for collaborative change? Like the African American struggle, there must be a historic and narrative-based move from Black power to Black engagement and contact. Now is the time for collaborative Dalit power, strategic contact, and well-designed projects in arts, culture, society that develop inter and intra-caste dialogue. So these are what I'm terming transitional justice mechanisms, right, broadly speaking. Such creative peace building and transitional justice requires contact. Fraternity, not nationalism, or ideological orthodoxy of any sort was Dr. Ambedkar's goal. Dr. Ambedkar himself said, quote, interdependence of one class on another is inevitable, end quote. If this is inevitable, then collaborative anti-caste activism is certainly necessary. Now is the time. Organize, educate, agitate, and do so collaboratively and strategically. Jai Bhim, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeremy Rinker, sir. Your enlightening words were really indeed inquisitive and made us all to think upon the core values of Ambedkar and value universal knowledge. And I'm sure it has helped us all to remember Dr. Ambedkar as a conflict transformation practitioner and a peace builder, and has encouraged all of us to adapt a collaborative perspective. Thank you so much again. Now I open the floor for discussion and question and answer for the audience. I request the audience to kindly raise the hand and the volunteers will bring the mic to you. Before that, and I request Deputy Director Bino Paulser to moderate the session.
Good evening, sir. Good Good evening, sir. As per your presentation, I got that I should go back to the again reading the Ambedkar values with peace perspective. Thank you for this presentation. My query is, as per your presentation, what I understood, alienation, caste alienation is a process. So, how much time it will take? That's my question. How much time it will take to eradicate?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for, and I appreciate the also looking at it with a peace perspective, because I do think that's important. I don't have an answer to the how long it takes. I mean, this is a similar question you might get in terms of race, and you see what's happened over the last, say, 5 years in the US context around race. The minute we think things are moving forward, we take a few steps back. And actually, I can project really loud. That's Test. Okay. So yeah, I was just thinking about. I mean, I hate to go back and continue to quote John Paul Lederach, but he is kind of seen as one of the grandfathers of the field, and he often talks about in peace building how the process is generational. That it takes it's not a short-term fix, and so people critique him for that. Resolution is quick. You're supposed to solve the problem, right? But he's arguing that it's a longer-term process. It's what he called a generational view, and he actually says in some of his writings that I kind of quoted it before, the idea of you take one step forward and 2 steps back, and another step forward and a couple steps back. You're still moving forward, right? You may not get there as fast, but I think that's the process of peace building. There's a few steps backwards and a few steps forward, and slowly there's progress. So I don't have an answer for like a specific time frame, but one of the things I want to highlight again that I said towards the end, just to reiterate it, I've been studying TBM and Ambedkar Buddhism for some time, and I've asked questions of various activists, Dalit Buddhist activists. I understand the need to create identity and to create self-esteem and to work to build the movement, critical goals, but at what point, and I've asked the same question, at what point do you move from that to then engagement with the other? And the responses I've usually gotten is, well, we're not there yet, right? We still have time to get there. And so I'm asking the same question. Okay, but when do we get there, right?
Hello.
Yeah, Mike here.
So I'm here, sir. So thank you so much, sir, for your presentation, as well as you were talking about so many important things, such as the interaction between the people, intercaste or intracaste, is very important. And other than that, you were also talking about we need to be the people who can move towards peace building through constructive process, right? But my question to you is, right, since you are working in this South Asian region, so have you experienced any kind of the people, like for me personally, in my experience, what I feel is the people from the disadvantaged background, for example here, the lower caste students, like right from TISS. So we are ready to collaborate, we are ready to contact the other people, and we are in the process because we are in these institutions which are very small, but these institutions provide the space so where we can interact. But my problem, which I face personally, as well as I am able to see in whole other people experiences, that other people, are they ready to contact and are they ready to make that progressive environment and So what I feel that in case of India, it is not really that kind of thing which I am able to observe. So I just wanted to understand that part. Other than that, when we move towards this kind of, for example, intercaste marriages, what I have seen, and there are so many instances, and where there is no safety net of such couples. So I want to know that, so this is very extreme case which I am talking about. So I'm not very sure that even if we are ready to contact, and so other people, are they ready to contact us and talk about it? So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, so thanks for the question. My first article related to the TBM movement that I wrote was, how can we talk to people who don't want to talk to us? And so that's, I mean, reminding me of some of the things I wrote in that article. That's why I was talking about transitional justice mechanisms, that not just the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, maybe India should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and create space and structure, but not just that. Maybe it's, if higher caste folks are not willing to engage, maybe it's creating some spaces where Dalits and SCs and OBCs can engage, right? And creating the spaces where those interactions could happen. So things like these examples I gave from the American South, right? Thinking of ways, so it's interesting because I've been traveling around and I see a lot of Ambedkar statues. And you know, Ambedkar's iconography is often used to claim space in India. And that's a strident way of using that image and that iconography, but I wonder if there's other ways to create more inclusive spaces where a higher caste person might be willing to come in and go, what is this thing? Why is this Ambedkar statue here? I don't know what that looks like exactly for the Indian context, but memorializing past harms that happened might be one way. Using those spaces where you might take over a basti with an Ambedkar statue to maybe do something different that tries to educate the wider community about Ambedkarite activism, Ambedkarite thought. I mean, I think it's interesting because when we create this identity around Dalit Buddhist or Dalit, we oftentimes discriminate against those outside of us. And so I see a lot of in-group solidification, self-esteem building, and a lot of funding and resources. I mean, there's wealthy Dalits who are helping fund the creation of a new, I was just in the Center for Dalit Studies in Hyderabad. Amazing building. And I was wondering, like, oh, this is a great, amazing resource for the Dalit community. And it's partly based on this idea of keeping money within the Dalit community. So if Dalits want to put together a program, they can use that space to rent, you know, a room or a hall like this to give a talk. And they don't have to give that to higher caste people, right? They're keeping it within. So I think that's great. It's brilliant. At the same time, I wonder how much is that reaching out outside of the Dalit community? So thinking of ways that we can use spaces like that to also bring an inclusive ability for people to come in to the conversation. And I mean, I think Ambedkar said, you mentioned intercaste marriages, so I'll just say, I think Ambedkar said that's really the crux of how the system continues, right? And so getting people to marry across caste lines is obviously another way that we can do a transitional justice kind of a move, right? Thank you for the question.
I liked your talk because I felt that you were coming from a context in the US where anti-racist movements have taken root and are, you know, reaching us as well. And perhaps your connect with Ambedkar and the Dalit movement here and your academic studies are rooted in some kind of pragmatism in your own context. That's why I found what you were saying carried weight with me. Your point about it is time now by 2023 for the Dalit community also to open up and for the need for contact. And of course, what one of the speakers said, is it really, because there is still a lot of denial from the other end, a refusal to speak. I think there are different contexts in which maybe it is already possible. Maybe in the urban context, maybe in the academic context a little bit. It would be difficult in a rural context where the mechanisms of power are so threatening that any kind of challenge to the existing order of power can be met with unbelievable violence, and one sees this still. But yes, I think on different levels it can happen, and the very fact that, in TISS I see the students now being culturally much more, the marginalized groups are expressing themselves through art, and I mean, you must have seen this in the preparation for this particular lecture. So I'm hopeful but it's not something that will happen overnight. There are many obstacles, I feel, and I'm a person who has been involved in anti-caste movements from an upper caste perspective, perhaps. One thing I would just like to mention, you mentioned Dalit autobiographies. I've very recently translated the autobiography of someone called R.B. More, who was associated with Ambedkar. He was associated with mobilizing people for the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927, and later on joined the Communist Party. And his autobiography is very interesting. He actually died before he completed it, but his son completed the story. Now, unfortunately, this came out in December 2019, and that is a bad time for any kind of discussions to be arranged on the book. I hope that it can happen now, because he's a character. I mean, the example you gave of Greensboro, Communist Workers' Party organizing an anti-Ku Klux Klan thing. I mean, the word communist is also nowadays quite taboo in this kind of context. So, a discussion on R.B. More, I'm just using this occasion to call for it to my friends, because he's somebody who makes both the communists and the Ambedkarites uncomfortable. He could be a bridge. He was seen as a bridge by his son between the Ambedkarites and the communists. But actually neither want to talk about him because they want to keep that distance. So I call for maybe somebody to take the initiative to talk about this book. It's definitely worth reading. I'll share the title with you.
I would love to read it. I'm not aware of it. So thank you for your comments. That excellent thing. This is the part I like, is the engagement and thinking about ways that we could actually do this kind of practice work. And your example of creating a space to talk about, dialogue about a Dalit autobiography that's maybe not known or recently came out, I think is an important kind of transitional justice mechanism. You also mentioned the rural-urban divide, and I think, yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, creating those contact spaces would look quite different in a rural village than they would in Mumbai, right? And you mentioned academic spaces and other potential spaces where there might be more synergy, more ability to do that. I think that's definitely true. I think these are the types of spaces like TISS Mumbai where these conversations should be being had. And then slowly this generational approach, they'll trickle out and they'll create those bridge builders that you're talking about. We need more bridge builders. And unfortunately, when we get stuck in identity constructs, it's often hard to be a bridge builder, right? Because it's them versus us, right? And we know from kind of the social psychology of identity that we all have multiple identities, but we can get trapped in primary identities, either as Dalit, or as high caste, or as OBC, or as woman, as man. These different identities can trap us in ways. And then the last thing I was thinking as you were talking, for those who are interested, you mentioned communism as being an identity. It's so interesting because there's a great video that was done on the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's called Closer to the Truth. If you Googled it, you could probably find a version of it now. It's called Closer to the Truth. A guy named Adam Zucker did the movie. And there's a scene in that movie, there's many really good scenes, but there's a scene in that movie where one of the survivors from the Greensboro and I've actually had Nelson Johnson come to my class. Nelson Johnson was the organizer of that march. He's now an African-American pastor in Greensboro, still alive. And Nelson Reverend Johnson will often say that I fought with the newspaper over and over and over again to talk about it wasn't a shootout. It wasn't the Greensboro shootout. It was the Greensboro massacre, right? And once that narrative gets set for shootout, it's so hard to shift it to a massacre. But one of the survivors in this video is driving down for one of the memorializations that group was doing. And she says something to the effect like, yeah, we were calling ourselves the communist worker. We were communists. We were organizing black and white groups of people to resist management, right, in textile mills. This was not popular in 1980. She said it would be like if I called myself a terrorist today, right? This identity pigeonholes me into, it's just like people, she said something like, these young people today don't understand that communist was a dirty word, right, in 1980. It's just really, really fascinating. So those are the thoughts that were coming in my mind as you were speaking.
James.
So we have 3 more questions.
James, sir. Sir, my question is that what are barriers of the alternative meta thoughts, social demographic thoughts, and transformation that not reach to vulnerable people or community after independence, 70 years after, but other side you see, right-wing thought easily reach to vulnerable community and people.
So you're saying the right wings have been able to reach to those vulnerable populations, but the kind of transformation narrative hasn't. That's kind of, I'm just trying to understand your question. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I would say transformation should be thought of as more than a metaphor. It's not just a metaphor, it's that process, right? So I think when I think of, Johann Galtung or John Paul Lederach and these people who are writing about peace and conflict studies, they're trying to create real processes, or even Paulo Freire for that matter. I mean, Paulo Freire, for those who don't know, read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I mean, his book, he's arguing, he's a Brazilian who was working with illiterates in Brazil. He was a professor, Marxist professor who was working with illiterates. And his argument, his thesis in some ways was that you had to help them understand that social oppression that they're under. You had to create conscientization, as he put it, right? This idea of a consciousness about, he used a Portuguese term to talk about it, but he called it conscientization, right? This idea that we need to create an awareness within that community. And so I think for transformation to take hold, that's got to happen in low-caste, vulnerable communities. And unfortunately, the nationalist narrative and the BJP kind of approach has been more effective in those spaces. More effective in terms of pulling people to their side. I mean, I find it fascinating. So the book that was quoted earlier that I wrote in 2018, Identity, Rights, and Awareness, it's about discursive practices and trying to really study TBM, TBMSG, another group called the People's Vigilance Committee on Human Rights, and BOMSEF. And in working with a lot of BOMSEF activists and trying to listen to what they would say, I was shocked by how many BOMSEF activists said, I came to BOMSEF through the RSS. I was, really? I said, well, how did this happen? This was fascinating to me. They started as college, many of them. started, and not all of them, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I talked to a good many people who said, I was a college student, I got attracted to the RSS, and then realized this ideology is wrong. This is not including me, it's not inclusive, it's exclusive. And then they found BOMSEF, and they shifted. And I was surprised by that. I think that's a story of a lot of BOMSEF activists, or at least the ones I interviewed. And so this tells you that message, that narrative, the way in which they're building organizing is effective, right? And so how does the Dalit community create ways that are as effective to organize?
So now we are taking just last two questions.
Yes, two more questions from the audience.
Sir, my question is added to other, I think inspectors are already asking. So I have a simple question, that in a country where religion has been historically a foundation of caste-based hierarchy and apathy, and in present situation of the country where there is a lot going around, how do you ensure that there will be contact would be possible? That has been your strategy about in peace building or in collaborative peace. So how in this situation or in this context, anyone can ensure the contact? Thank you.
Yeah. So I would say, there's a lot I can say to that. I probably don't have time to say everything, but I'll say, like, as you were asking the question, this idea of fundamentalism's not I would argue that there's a fundamentalist aspect to that Hindu interpretation of Hinduism and use of the Shastras and ways of oppressing people. That fundamentalism is not just in India, it's all over the world. And so I would say interreligious dialogue is necessary too. Having Navayana Buddhists, having Tibetan Buddhists, having Hindus try to come together and have some conversations. They're not easy conversations, but conversations about what do I believe? How do I, in the US there's some left-leaning Hindu organizations that are starting, Hindus for Human Rights, for example, and some of these groups are starting to kind of have these conversations. I think it's at a tertiary phase in some ways, it's a beginning phase, but I'm also thinking about, when you said that, I was thinking about, so I worked, while I was finishing my dissertation, I worked with a faculty member who also runs an institute called the Salam Institute for Peace and Justice. He's a Palestinian, his name is Mohammed Abu Nimer, and Mohammed Abu Nimer is a Palestinian peace and conflict studies scholar, and he argues strongly for interfaith dialogue. That's his whole career has been based on interfaith dialogue in the Muslim world. So he's working mostly in the Muslim world and trying to build those kind of dialogues across Abrahamic traditions. So Hinduism doesn't really fall in what he's doing, but that approach of interfaith dialogue, I think, is needed and necessary. And there was something else I was going to say about Muhammad, but it'll come back to me. Muhammad, you should look up Abu Nimer. He's written lots of things. He's sought after in a way because he's a Palestinian working in peace and conflict studies. And he happened to graduate. So one of the things that you might have noticed from my slide, one of the things about my school and the field of peace and conflict studies is it's really grown. He graduated many years before me. He was a senior to me and a colleague and a mentor in some ways to me. He graduated from what was then called, I think, the Center for Conflict Resolution. When I graduated in 2009 from George Mason, it was called the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, or ICAR. It's now called the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So you can see it's moved from a center to an institute to a school, and actually taken the name of our former and longest living president, who's actually on his deathbed now as we speak. I keep looking at the news to see, but it's called the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So you can see even that field has evolved, and it's been people like Abu Nimer who have helped push that idea of contact and so his dissertation work was actually on contact in the Arab-Israeli dispute. So if you look back, he's got a book from SUNY Press about Arab, it's I think 1998, 97 when he wrote this book, but he's still doing that work, and so there are people there doing that kind of work, and I would say look to them to see if you can build models for the dharmic traditions here in India, because it is a different context. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. This is question from one of the TISS alumni who is currently in Texas. So he is asking, when we talk of caste conflict, most of the time it's Shudra caste that commit violence on Dalit. This intensify the conflict between Dalit and Shudras. In a such context, how do we humanize the oppression who is committing violence against Dalit?
Can we have the other question, please?
Yes. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for this enlightening lecture. I have one small question. Like what you have talked and what I have understand is that the peace in India has been disturbed because of caste differences, and you, as you like, according to you, there is a like conflict that has occurred because of caste distinction. The narrative that you have attached to the caste, but is caste only related to the conflict? Because what I can understand is that caste is a primary contradiction in Indian reality. So yes, that is my question.
This is the last question of the evening. Sorry to other people sitting in the audience.
So yeah, I mean, I'll respond to both those. I think the first question about Shudras and low castes being kind of proxies for higher caste interests is, I mean, this idea of Sanskritization, of course, that Srinivas talks about is obviously clear in what I would be talking about in terms of caste conflict. It's rarely the highest echelons of Indian society perpetuating the atrocities against the low caste. It's actually people somewhere in the middle, right, that are being used as proxies and thinking of themselves as, oh, if I do these actions, if I engage in this kind of thing, I might be able to move up the graded inequality. I might be able to be more like the Brahmins or the folks who are above me, right? So I think that's a valid point, and I would say that, you know, that's why I'm calling for intra-caste dialogue. Getting the right parties to the table in terms of contact and dialogue is critical, right? So how do you, that conflict and that contact and dialogue in one context of India might look very different than in another context of India. So if you did this in Uttar Pradesh, it might not look the same as in Maharashtra or, you know, Tamil Nadu, right? It may look quite different. So I think that's how I would respond to that. And then I don't know how to respond to that. I think when I talk about caste conflict, I think I'm thinking about all the ways that hierarchy, if you go back to like Dumont and others who wrote about hierarchy, right? All the ways that hierarchy are impacting Indian society. And so I think there are micro ways that we can all engage with those hierarchies. And some of them aren't necessarily caste hierarchies. So I was having this conversation the other day about, you know, in my country, when we go to a restaurant, the waiter doesn't feed us, doesn't put the food on our plate, right? But this is a kind of a hierarchical attitude within India where this is tradition, this is custom. Why is this that the food gets placed on your plate? I personally don't like that custom because I often get given too much food or too little food. I'd rather just do it myself, right? And so I often stop the waiter and say, no, it's okay, I'll dip myself, right? And so this is a kind of challenging a cultural norm in society. And oftentimes it causes the waiter or the owner of the restaurant much angst because I'm challenging this, right? I'm saying, no, it's okay. No, but we have to do this, right? And they're insisting that they, so I think there's ways that we can challenge these norms in ways that shift hierarchies, right? And so I would say that's what I'm talking, and I think you need contact in order to do that. I'm in a privileged space as a foreigner to be able to push back in a way that maybe an Indian couldn't, right? Or at least not in the same way, right? There would be a different reaction. And so finding those places in your context as an Indian to be able to push back against, I don't really like this hierarchy, right? How do I, in India, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think about this and people might be familiar or maybe not with a guy named Gert Hofstede who wrote this book called Software of the Mind. And it's a book that he did a mass survey of IBM culture around the world. So IBM was in the 1980s and 90s when he was doing his survey research, was in I think like 178 different countries. And he was collecting data on, and he's somewhat controversial, but he created a kind of a global image of what he called national dimensions of culture. And he had things like individualism and collectivism. Well, guess what? I come from the most individualistic country on earth, right? The US is #1 on the individualism scale in his survey. But then you get to a thing he calls power distance index, right? He calls it the PDI, the power distance index. And India's not #1, but it's pretty far up there. It's pretty high up on the power distance. So this kind of way in which people treat people lower than them on a social class, on social class or caste, or by position, the way in which we defer to teachers and defer to business leaders and defer to prime minister, right, all the way up the chain. It's very much a hierarchical society, and so thinking of ways that you could shift that you could push against that you could change norms, I think would be one way to engage in some kind of contact and transitional justice mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeremy Rinker, sir, and thank you so much, Binopal, sir, for moderating the session. Now, I request Deputy Director, Dr. Binopal, sir, to present Dr. Jeremy Rinker with a memento, Buddha statue. Thank you so much, sir. Now I request Professor Ramaya, sir, to say a few words.
Yeah, before we conclude, I just happened to see a few very important individuals, in my opinion. As you entered the convention center, you must have seen a Rangoli. Very amazing, very pretty, unbelievable Rangoli. The artist is sitting here. I'd like to invite him on the stage.
Mr. Kailash,
yeah, Kailash, please.
A big round of applause for Rangoli artist.
With a flower bouquet.
I request Ramaya, sir, to kindly felicitate Mr. Kailash with a floral bouquet. And a special mention and a message from our director, TISS, Shalini ma'am. She really appreciated and loved the beautiful creation by Mr. Kailash.
I just happened to see Mr. Bise, who championed the struggle in Tata Institute, retired. But we have been kind enough to have Mr. Bise. Can you please come over, please?
I request you, sir, to kindly come on the stage.
Mr. Shailesh, to just bring him. Mr. Bodhi, yeah, please come.
May I please have a big round of applause for Mr. Bise? I request Professor Ramaya sir to felicitate Mr. Hussain.
He saved so many people's employment here, so many people's life. And he made us humble beginning as an assistant in the dining hall, rose to the level of deputy registrar. Thank you so much. I mean, no words to explain his contribution. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I call upon stage Roshan Shirkare, the convener of AML 2023, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Rosalie. Good evening and Jai Bhim, one and all present here. Honorable Speaker, Dr. Jeremy Rinker, Director TISS Mumbai, Shalini Bharat ma'am, Deputy Director TISS Mumbai, Bino Paul sir, Professor Ramaya sir, Dean Equal Opportunity Center and Faculty, Center for Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy, TISS Mumbai, respected faculty members, professor, dignitaries, guests, speaker, students and alumni. I deem it a great privilege to extend a vote of thanks on this occasion. On the behalf of AML 2023 Organizing Committee, I, Roshan Shirkare, convener AML 2023, would firstly like to thank today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeremy Rinker sir, on the behalf of everyone. Thank you for agreeing to deliver this lecture. It was indeed very inclusive and fascinating. It was very well received by all of us. You were very present here despite your busy schedule. Is a reflection of your commitment towards your work. Hearty vote of thanks against gracing today's events and sharing your thought with this august audience. I would also like to thank Director TISS Mumbai, Shalini Bharat ma'am, Deputy Director Bino Paul sir, for chairing and moderating today's event. On the behalf of AML Organizing Committee 2023, I would also like to thank Professor Ramaya sir for being constant support and guiding us throughout to make this event successful like every single year. I also extend my thanks to all faculty members, staff, both teaching and non-teaching, alumni who have joined us from a different part of world. There are many people who have worked very hard since last few months to making this event possible. I extend my deep gratitude to all members of organizing committee and student volunteers for their tireless effort. Despite the several challenges we face in organizing the event first time after the pandemic, I must also express my gratitude to Siva Kumar sir who helped us with the technical assistance in bringing this event to all who have joined us from everywhere. Last but not least, I pay my sincere request to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, the greatest Indian, whose life and his legacy and his inspiration for people globally, and whose honor to conduct this event every year. With this, I would like to conclude my speech, and once again, congratulations to AML Organizing Committee 2023. Thank you everyone for present here. Jai Bhim. I would also request to proceed to the dining hall. The dinner is organized by the AML Organizing Committee 2023. And lastly, I want to thank to Tata Institute to provide this space for us. We can begin for dinner after national anthem. Thank you and Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much, Roshan. I also like to thank the staff and the security staff at TISS Mumbai for their coordination and cooperation. Thank you so much for making this event possible. Now I request the national anthem to be played, and I request everyone to
Jana Mana Adhinayaka Jaya He Bharat Bhagya Vidhata Punjab Sindh Gujarat Maratha Dravida Utkala Vanga Vindhya Himachala Yamuna Ganga Uchala Jaladhi Taranga Tava Shubha Name Jage Tava Shubha Ashish Mange Gahe Tava Jaya Gatha Jana Gana Mangala Dayaka Jaya He Bharat Bhagya Vidhata Jaya He Jaya He Jaya He Jaya 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 He
Bharat Mata Ki
With this, I, Rosalie Gaikwad, would like to thank once again Dr. Jeremy Rinker and our esteemed dignitaries and the audience for making this event successful. Now I officially declare the end of the 19th Dr. Ambedkar Memorial Lecture. Thank you everyone.